Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Shardello. I'm the Managing Symposium Editor for the Michigan Journal of Law Reform, and we're really excited to welcome you today to our third panel, and I will kick it off to our moderator, Professor Edmonds.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third panel on this wonderful conference. Today, we're going to be talking about the consequences of fines and fees, and we have a great lineup for you. Because there's a sea of faces out there, I'm going to introduce each speaker before they make their particular remarks. And so the first question I'm going to throw to the panelists is just drawing from the panel title. What are some significant consequences of the assessment of fines and fees? And we're going to start with Kimberly Buddin. Kimberly Buddin is a policy counsel at the ACLU of Michigan. She works with lawmakers and stakeholders to advance policies that promote and protect individual civil rights and civil liberties, provides legal analyses on proposed legislation, and testifies before the Michigan House of Representatives and Senate committees. And she's also an adjunct professor at Wayne State School of Law.
Thanks so much, Mira. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about this issue. This is just something that's been plaguing the state of Michigan and all the various courts, as well as so many marginalized communities. So, to really address, I know this has been talked about a little bit in some of the other sessions, but I'm excited to kind of dig in deep here. I think the pretty obvious impact of fines and fees is there is a significant demographic impact on marginalized communities, and communities of color are disproportionately burdened because they're disproportionately poor and overrepresented in our prisons and our jails. We know that there are some defendants who end up incarcerated because they're assessed certain fees, but then when they're arrested, they're actually assessed another fee, a jail entry fee, and then also have to pay room and board for being in the jail, and then additionally reimbursement to the correction system for any sort of services, medical needs, etc. And this just traps people in a cycle of poverty. A lot of these individuals are folks with lower education, they're high school dropouts, individuals with mental illness are disproportionately represented amongst these groups, as well as folks who are struggling with substance use disorders. And so these are individuals who don't need to necessarily even be behind bars in the first place. And the only reason that they're there is simply because they have this fine or this fee that they can't afford to pay for a variety of different reasons. We also know that a lot of this debt comes from things like unpaid tickets, which disproportionately impacts the urban areas and cities like Detroit, where there are some of the lowest income residents with the highest rate of accumulated ticket debt. And those are largely African-American communities. And so it's certainly, there's a disproportionate impact on some of these marginalized communities. There's also a major impact and a consequence of getting your license suspended. I know this group is going to talk a little bit more about that, but this is one of the common ways in which individuals who have fines or fees that they haven't paid, those fines are collected. The consequence of getting your driver's license suspended is particularly detrimental here in the state of Michigan, where many communities don't have a reliable transit system. So after somebody is ticketed by the police, they are ordered to pay really high fines. There's fees and penalties associated with that. They have to pay costs to the court, and this can add up to hundreds of dollars just for a single ticket. And so we've really created a system where district courts need to be self-funding and even profit generating. And unfortunately, these monetary penalties are really using the state's poorest and most marginalized people as their primary system of revenue. I read this report that really broke down how much a single traffic ticket can cost. And so you've got your first infraction, which is upwards of $100. You've got courts fines and fees, which could be upwards of $100. You've got a justice system assessment and a late penalty. And if you didn't pay, you have also penalties for not paying for if it's a misdemeanor offense. You have your driving while having a suspended license. You have your license reinstatement fee to the court. You have a license reinstatement fee to the Secretary of State. So you're looking at over $1,000 just to get your driver's license reinstated for something that you couldn't afford to pay in the first place. So what we see is people having to make this decision about whether or not they're going to put food on their table, whether or not they're going to pay their rent, whether or not they're going to pay for education for their kids, or if they're going to pay a ticket to the state of Michigan or to the city of Detroit or Lansing, or they're just going to go ahead and drive around with a suspended license, which has additional implications once you get caught. The recent jails task force found that the third most common reason for arrest entry into the jail system was actually driving related offenses. So driving on a suspended license. And so our jails are flooded with people who are simply there because they've had to make this choice. And certainly this, again, has a disproportionate impact on low-income neighborhoods because people are often living in communities where there aren't a lot of jobs, and so they have to travel outside of their own communities in order to work. And certainly these suspensions don't make our roadways any safer. They force people to really choose between unemployment and bankruptcy or going to jail. And then I wanted to bring up kind of another impact is simply the fact that if somebody is arrested because they have not paid these fines or fees, which certainly warrants do come into the conversation, being arrested has cascading consequences for not only that person, but for their families as a whole in the community. Research shows that it can jeopardize a person's not only their employment, but also their housing stability, their child custody, their access to health care, all of which then has the increased consequence of increasing the likelihood of recidivism rates and reoffending. And there's also an increased likelihood for folks who are non-citizens that their additional contact with the legal system will expand the likelihood that they'll have contact with immigration enforcement. And this cycle of poverty that I was discussing earlier also will increase the likelihood that they'll have to go on some sort of state assistance, which may cause them to be deemed a public charge under immigration law, which can then lead to denial of relief or any of their applications or even removal. So there's some pretty devastating consequences that come with this that folks that often don't think about. And the last one I just really wanted to point out is this can lead to death. The ACLU of Michigan had a client who was sentenced to serve 30 days in Macomb County after he was unable to afford just over $700 in fines. And these all stemmed from 2 outstanding traffic tickets. And he was 32 years old and he ended up dying in that facility. And certainly nobody could say that your ability to pay some monetary fine and fee should be worth the cost of your life. But that's certainly the way that we set up our system. It costs people their lives, it costs people their liberty, it costs people their families. And so it really is a detriment to the entire community.
Great. Thank you for that really wonderful overview and also the reminder of the really horrible consequences that can be at stake in this situation. Next, we're going to turn to Professor Steve Mello, who's an assistant professor of economics at Dartmouth College. He's an applied microeconomist interested in inequality. His work uses administrative data sets and quasi-experimental research methods to examine the costs, benefits, and equity implications of public policies with a particular focus on the criminal justice system.
Can you guys see my slides? Are we good? Okay,
Yeah,
great. Well, thanks so much for that intro, Mira, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here. So as Mira mentioned, I'm an economist, and I'm going to talk about this question more from a data perspective. And my intro is going to be pretty similar to Kimberly's, but I'm going to show you some data. So whenever I'm asked to talk about this topic, I always sort of gravitate towards showing this picture first. This is one of those pictures that I sort of sit there and stare at for hours at a time. But anyway, let's talk about the question of who's affected by fines. We have lots and lots of what I would call anecdotal evidence that low-income communities bear the burden of low-level policing, where we see most of the assessment of fines in our criminal justice system. We have things like the Ferguson report. We have a lot of popular media coverage. But what does the data really say about this question? So what I'm showing you here in this picture is I took data on all the traffic tickets issued in the state of Florida over like a 10-year period. And I computed the neighborhood citation rate. So this is like the number of traffic tickets issued to residents of a particular zip code. And I computed the per capita income of that zip code. And I'm plotting them against each other here on this graph. And you can see this really, really strong negative correlation. So the data really do bear out this story. Residents of the poorest neighborhoods in Florida receive traffic tickets at about twice the rate of residents of the richest zip codes in Florida. And moving on to what is really the question I'm supposed to be talking about, what is the effect of fines on individuals? From my perspective, thinking about this like an economist, this is a really hard question to answer. And some of the things that make this a really hard question to answer, number one, are data problems. Okay, so if we wanted to answer this question in data, what would we need? We would need some data on the identity of individuals who get fined, and that can be really challenging, especially given that court data sets tend to be local, and so if we want to get a big sample, it can be a big challenge. And then we need to link those data on fined individuals to data on outcomes. So this would be things like employment status, housing situation, personal finances, maybe incarceration, right? And then the second big issue is what I would call an identification problem. So this is really when we want to start thinking about causal inference. So let's say we were able to get some data on these outcomes, right? Like employment status of a bunch of people. And then I told you that half of them were fined a year ago and the other half weren't. Are the differences between those groups caused by fines, or would those individuals have looked differently even if the fined group hadn't been fined? So these are kind of the two big obstacles, in my view, to knowing sort of a lot about this question. And so what I did is I wrote a paper, and I'm really trying to answer this question: what is the effect of fines on low-income individuals? So I linked administrative traffic citation records for the entire state of Florida over 2011 to 2015 to a panel of quarterly credit reports for cited drivers. Credit reports give you a way to measure an individual's financial situation, basically how are they doing financially, and the outcomes that I focus in my study are basically defaults on bills. So unpaid debt and collections is going to be one of the key outcomes in my paper, for example. And something that's interesting to note is that credit report data isn't going to include unpaid traffic tickets. So if we see effects in my paper, it's going to be because people are missing other bills after they get fined. And then I use a difference in differences approach, which is basically, I'm going to take a bunch of drivers who get cited at a particular time, and I'm going to look at the change in their financial outcomes around the time when they get a traffic ticket. And I'm going to compare that to the change for individuals who don't get tickets at that time. So we have kind of a treat control pre-post setup here. And this here is just one figure from my paper. So what I'm showing you here is the fraction of individuals who have a new default appear on their credit report in a given quarter. So this blue line right here, this is the treatment group. So these are people who get a ticket right here. And this red line here, this is the control group, okay? So we see this big spike in the likelihood of a new default in the, let's say, 5 quarters after an individual receives a traffic ticket. And then if we split that up by income groups. So here I'm just doing the simplest thing you could possibly do, split the sample on the basis of above median, below median income at baseline. And these squares and circles plot treat control differences, okay? So we see this big increase, 2 percentage points in the likelihood of a new default for the low income group, which is the green squares, and basically nothing for the high income group. And when I think about how to interpret my results, something that I really want to make sure I drive home here is, so there's lots of attention paid to the non-payment cycle, which Kimberly talked about, the idea that individuals get fined, they don't pay their fines, then they face a driver's license suspension, and then they're subject to a misdemeanor charge, possibly arrest, possibly more fines. And I have no doubt that that's very important. But in my setting, most fines are paid. It's really hard to estimate the exact share of fines that end up getting paid on time due to data issues like I talked about at the beginning. But most of the fines in my data are paid. And when I focus on a group of people who definitely pay their fines, I see basically a very similar set of results. Okay, so what this means is that people find a way to cover their traffic fines at the expense of other financial obligations, which is going to have pretty significant economic harm in the long run for this group of low-income individuals. Really quick, another slide on interpretation. If you take my point estimates and you try to figure out what they mean is basically that low-income individuals borrow about between $75 and $130 from other financial obligations to cover their traffic fines, okay? And that means they're going to take pretty significant hits on their credit scores. They might be unable to get credit cards in the future. This is going to have significant long-term effects on your financial well-being. And the kind of underlying problem here is a lack of, or sort of prevalence of, financial precarity in the population in general. And just to wrap up, I wanted to talk quickly about racial disparities in fine assessment. So I have another paper with Felipe Gonzalez at UCLA, where we show that Florida Highway Patrol officers are racially biased when they choose whom to be lenient to during speeding stops. Okay, so this, just to quickly explain this paper, so this graph right here shows the fraction of speeding tickets issued for each speed by the race of the driver. Okay, and the fine schedule in Florida is like this. Okay, so there's this big jump in fine moving from 9 to 10 miles an hour over the limit. And we see over a third of all tickets written for exactly 9 miles an hour over. And we do a bunch of work in the paper to show that this is what you think it is. It's officers are pulling people over going 15 miles an hour over the limit. They're writing 9 miles an hour over the limit on the ticket. And that results in a reduced fine, okay? And we show that officers are systematically racially biased in making that decision, okay? So the number on that bias is 6 percentage points. White drivers are 6 percentage points more likely than non-white drivers to get that $75 break on their fines. If you just do a back of the envelope calculation, 500,000 tickets a year times 6% times $75, which is this jump in the fine, that's over $2.2 million in extra fines charged to non-white drivers per year due to racial bias, okay? And if you think about the results that I just showed you, that can have pretty big implications for individuals' financial and economic well-being. And I will unshare my screen.
Great, thank you so much. That's really fascinating research. Okay, so we're going to turn next to Professor J Prescott, who is a professor of law and economics here at Michigan. His research interests revolve around criminal law, sentencing law and reform, access to justice, employment law, and the dynamics of civil litigation, particularly settlement. And he also spearheaded the development of Matterhorn, which is an online platform that helps people facing warrants, fines, and minor charges to resolve their disputes online without the need to hire an attorney. I'll turn it over to you, Professor Prescott.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Mira, and thanks to the Journal of Law Reform for hosting the symposium. I think it's really important, and they have assembled just excluding me, a fantastic set of people, and I'm really grateful that they let me come along. So my story on fines and fees and how I became interested in it was really a focus on the low end of this story, minor fines, typically for traffic. There are a lot of fines and fees that apply to more serious criminal issues, of course, but I started there, and the reason I started there was because I was very interested in essentially civil infractions that led to warrants for arrest, particularly for failure to pay. So for those of you who don't know, and I encourage you to listen to the panels from the last couple of days and tomorrow as well, I guess the rest of the week. But there are millions and millions of outstanding warrants in this country for the simple fact that people, as a general matter, oftentimes can't pay their traffic tickets, and they often don't know what to do in those situations. So if you have a traffic ticket and you don't really know what to do, a typical human response is to sort of hope it goes away, and certainly not do something that's really scary, which is to go into court and try to explain what's going on in your life. And so my interest here was to try to figure out a way to help resolve that split, that essentially failure to come together. That we had millions of people in the U.S. who had an explanation for their inability to pay a fine or fee, and yet were unable to make it, or at least not able to make that, to provide that explanation without a serious risk taking on their part. And part of that is because under U.S. law and the law of every state, as far as I'm aware, if a judge decides that you're not paying because you're willfully refusing to pay, perhaps because you're a smoker, or because you're wearing an expensive looking NFL jacket, or new shoes. All of these are reasons that you have cable TV. All of these are reasons that judges have given for deciding that somebody who says they can't pay actually can pay. They have the ability, and often do, decide to put you in jail. Now, of course, they do that in lots of other situations as well, of course. But for people who have outstanding debts for really minor things, this can really interfere with the system. So my goal was to try to use technology to connect people and to allow them to kind of come to some sort of solution, either through a payment plan or a reduction in fine or some other process. And that's where I've kind of come into these issues. Now, I want to acknowledge right now that I've always been a little bit torn about this, because in some ways, fines and fees, you've already heard of some of the most critical consequences. I think they can be described as, one, for people who don't have a lot of resources, asking them to give up money has a lot of consequences for them, whether they have the money or can scrape together or not. We learned that from Steve. And two, if you don't have the money, there's an incredible domino effect that happens that leads you way down the road, so that you can wind up with a traffic ticket that's $150, and 5 years later you've literally paid the state $5,000 and you still owe them another $5,000 because you just wound up with this ticket that you initially couldn't pay, and you've always been struggling to get caught up. So making the system operate better is a little bit of a fraught idea, because I sometimes worry that making fines better or easier to use by courts and more efficient will have the effect of inducing courts or systems to use them more. And I fully acknowledge that. But I guess I started from this in this area by focusing on the potential upside of fines and fees as a form of punishment. I'm not sure if you guys have sort of heard this story yet, but when thinking about a fine as a punishment, typically the way an economist starts by thinking about it is that it's much better than most other punishments. Why? Because if somebody pays a fine, it hurts them, but the money can be used for something something better. Now, hopefully it's not being used by courts to support their processes or used to enforce the fines, dissipating all of the money, but at least in theory, you can punish people using a transfer. So there's no actual destruction of wealth or welfare. So compare that to incarceration, where we actually pay to make somebody much worse off. With a fine, if you can operate a system that works well, it punishes somebody, but that money can be redistributed. So I urge you all to think about ways that we might use fines or craft this system to work better, because I also worry that if fines become too much of an area of focus, we won't we'll move towards other solutions that are maybe even worse. So anyways, my goal is to quickly talk about three less anticipated consequences of fines and fees. I think a lot of you who've been attending these sessions have heard a lot. And the first one I want to talk about is system avoidance behavior. Fines are a touch point because they're fairly easy to give. A lot of people get them. And if you can pay your ticket quickly, then often it's not really a big issue to you. You don't think about having a long-term relationship with law enforcement or the criminal justice system. But for those who can't pay it right away or who struggle, especially if it winds up turning into a warrant, and we know that's much more likely to happen depending on your socioeconomic status, then we have a world in which there are, as I mentioned, millions of people with warrants. So what do people with warrants do? Well, of course, they might, because they want to get rid of the warrant, pay their the money they owe. That's the theory. But in practical terms, that's not usually what happens. Instead, they wind up avoiding systems. So they avoid systems that, here I'm going to just show you a well-known paper in this space. They, let's see, Sarah Brain's piece that basically focuses on the consequences of having this ongoing relationship with the criminal justice system. So, for example, people who have warrants, even these minor warrants, they don't vote, they don't call the police when they're victimized, they avoid situations where they might wind up coming into contact with police. And of course, all of that makes a lot of sense. Like, we would think somebody with an outstanding arrest warrant might engage in that kind of behavior, but once you realize just how pervasive these kinds of warrants are and the concern that people have about their outstanding debt to the criminal justice system, it gets even worse. So we can think of fines and fees as essentially a surveillance tool. It gives the ability of the criminal justice system to always show up and knock. The Supreme Court has decided that if you have outstanding warrants, even for failure to pay fines, right, not for a crime, even for a warrant that results from a civil citation, that you can be searched by the police. So you lose a lot of your Fourth Amendment rights. Of course, incarceration also isolates people and takes away their ability to access a lot in our society. But I think it's far less known and acknowledged that that fines and warrants wind up essentially disenfranchising and disempowering people who also don't spend any time. They spend less time getting medical care, less time signing up for education, all places where they think the government might have eyes. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is procedure-produced disparities. So Steve talked a little bit about policing-related disparities, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on a paper I worked on in which people who had outstanding traffic fines decided to come to court and contest those fines, or actually at least negotiate for a reduced fine, right? And the implicit in a fine, in getting a ticket, is this idea that the government is making an allegation against you and that you have the right to contest that, okay? But of course, the right and ability to contest that depends on your ability to access justice, to actually speak with somebody who can help you to come to court. And courts oftentimes are, they're physical places, and they're often very difficult for people to get to. So in this paper, what we do is we actually look at disparities across groups in outcomes, depending on whether somebody had to go to court in person to deal with a ticket, or using an online technology, Matterhorn, that I mentioned before. And there could be at least two theories why, if there are disparities, they might change in an online system. The first is implicit bias. So anytime you go to a court in person, your identity traits are going to be visible to decision makers, and to the extent we think that that affects the decisions they make. Again, this is not policing. This is after you've gotten a ticket and you're coming to court to try to negotiate it, to try to contest it. That decision may actually be influenced in court by your identity. The second is that online treatment of tickets just differs. So for example, you write out your explanation. You're not asked to stand up in front of a judge or speak to court staff to explain yourself. And we might think that different groups are better situated to use those two different approaches. So what do we find when we look at this? Well, we find disparities and changes on two different dimensions, both age and race. And so here, what you see is that for people who try to deal with a ticket when they're young, if they go to court, they actually don't do all that well. They wind up doing much less well than people who are older. And this is consistent with what a lot of judges actually say they're going to do. That they don't treat younger people the same because younger people are less trustworthy, more dangerous, and have a lot to learn. And so we actually see that younger people are not treated the same when you control for all observables. And then when you move to an online setting where, of course, the judges seeing all of the same types of information that they normally would, but they don't necessarily, it's difficult, much more difficult for them to determine somebody's age. We see a big change in that disparity. Here is that disparity for race. So people who come, Black people who come into courts this is in Michigan, they wind up receiving much higher fines typically. And when it moves to an online setting, you see that the disparity seems really to disappear. And again, there are two accounts for this. One is implicit bias is lessened or removed, and the other is that the process is just much different. You don't have to deal with walking into a court where somebody who doesn't look like you asks you to defend yourself in front of 50 people, which turns out to be difficult for certain communities, more difficult than it is for others. So changing how we allow people to object to allegations made against them can really make a difference potentially. But in this research, we can't really tell the difference between those two. The last thing I wanted to talk about is another more difficult to quantify effect of fines and fees, namely that if you're poor, then you're going to have a lot more work to do when you get a citation that's a flat rate. So somebody who's wealthy or privileged, they can just pay it. They don't ever have to talk about or disclose what problems they have in their lives. But that's not true for somebody who we say, well, there's a court here, you can go and explain your issue. I mean, explaining your issue involves a huge violation of privacy, and it's really not very pleasant. So the idea that we have a system that requires people to bear all in order to receive equal treatment is not a great one. And so here are some research I did with Megan O'Neill, some quotes from people who actually these are explanations that they gave in an online setting. But the idea here is that this is what they would have had to say in a world, and these are not real names, by the way, I should just let you know, but these are what they would have to say, or what they were expected to say in court in order to justify having their fine reduced. And you can see that, disclosing that you're homeless, disclosing that, that you've been donating plasma for money and to get your son back and forth to school. I mean, these are not easy things to talk about, and to ask poor people only to come in and explain those is a disparate effect that I think it's worth spending time talking about. Okay, I'll stop there. I'm sorry for going on so long.
Thank you so much, Professor Prescott, for all that wonderful food for thought. And I think your last point is particularly interesting insofar as there are lots of ways across our court system, both the criminal and the civil aspects of it, where we do require that that sort of like show of stories and subject people to embarrassment as sort of an unintentional effect, I think. Last but certainly not least, we have Professor Beth Colgan, who's a professor of law at the UCLA School of Law. She's one of the country's leading experts on constitutional and policy issues related to the use of economic sanctions as punishment, and particularly on the 8th Amendment's excessive fines clause.
All right, thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. So we've heard, and you've heard in prior panels as well, really bracing articulation of some of the consequences that the use of economic sanctions has for people who have no meaningful ability to pay them or absorb the loss of that income or those finances. I'm going to add 3 more things to the mix just to try to help round it out, although it's actually impossible to fully articulate all of the various consequences these systems can have. But let me add a few things. So first, there are ways in which the inability to pay economic sanctions can serve as a bar to voting rights. In all states other than Maine and Vermont, and most recently Washington, D.C., people convicted of certain crimes, typically, though not always felony offenses, lose the right to vote. There are some mechanisms to become re-enfranchised after certain conditions are met. And what I'm going to focus on here are conditions that relate to the payment of economic sanctions. Now, this gained press attention in the last year or two because of Amendment 4 in Florida, which was a voter-approved state constitutional amendment that said that people who had been disenfranchised due to a conviction would become automatically restored to the right to vote upon completion of all terms of their sentence. The Florida legislature then defined the word completion to include payment of all fines, fees, and restitution. Now, there are a number of problems with this, including that the local courts in Florida had not kept records sufficient to determine who had or who had not completed payment in many cases, meaning that people who may have been eligible to vote were barred from doing so because they were unable to prove it. But of course, the broader problem is that the law, which was upheld by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, in effect means that if a person is too poor to pay his or her economic sanctions, it prevents that person from voting. Now, Florida is far from alone here, though it's harder than you might think to figure out the circumstances under which this might occur. So the laws in a handful of states are explicit. So in some places more explicit even than Florida. For example, in Alabama, the relevant statute state that to be restored to the right to vote, a person must have paid all fines, court costs, fees, and victim restitution. In other states, the requirements are more hidden because the statutes require completion of parole or probation. And as I'll discuss in a moment, parole and probation terms can in some cases be longer for those who cannot pay their economic sanctions. And in still other states, people can vote so long as they're not incarcerated, regardless of whether they have outstanding debt. But if a person were to be incarcerated, even for a brief period that coincides with an election due to non-payment, again, that would prohibit them from participating in an election during that period. Now, even beyond the standard felony disenfranchisement context, we know that people who are incarcerated in jail pre-trial or after a misdemeanor conviction, in other words, people who have never been disenfranchised and thus are eligible to vote, are often effectively disenfranchised when jailers refuse to allow election workers into jail facilities or prevent people from voting absentee. And again, if people are incarcerated due to the non-payment of economic sanctions, maybe they've been picked up on a warrant that was discussed earlier, and that's because they have no meaningful ability to pay, this would serve as yet another form of wealth-based penal disenfranchisement. Okay, so let's spend another minute talking about probation and parole and the relationship to economic sanctions. So of course, these forms of community custody carry with them numerous and often onerous restrictions on who a person can associate with, where they can live, how they spend their time, requirements for reporting, for participating in drug testing, and on and on and on. And often comes with the addition of monthly supervision fees, some of which are waivable, some not, depends on the jurisdiction. But in many states, the length of the probation term or parole term, in other words, how long the person is subject to those conditions, depends on how quickly they're able to pay their economic sanctions. So this either happens because the person becomes eligible for early termination only if the sanctions are paid, or because the law allows the term of probation or parole to be extended if there is ongoing debt. Now, there's a growing recognition, including among many prosecutors, that probation has become too lengthy and too punitive. So paying attention to how the inability to pay economic sanctions plays into those terms of probation and parole is an important policy discussion to have. And finally, I just want to note the downstream implications if a person were to be charged with or convicted of a different offense. So on the front end, when pretrial detention is determined, courts often look at whether the person has complied with all terms of prior sentences, as well as failures to appear for prior court hearings. If a person cannot comply with the requirement to pay in a prior case or failed to appear at a court hearing for fear that they'd be subject to arrest for non-payment, this can mean that in the new case, they are detained pre-trial, which we know has significant implications for their ability to defend against new charges, as well as implications that we heard earlier about maintaining your employment and housing and childcare. And in the age of COVID, it could even mean death. And as courts shift to the use of risk assessment algorithms to aid in determining pretrial bail, there's a real risk that non-payment of prior economic sanctions can be built into those algorithms in a way that doesn't reflect the realities of an inability to pay. Now, at the back end, at sentencing, those same circumstances might be a reason for a judge who has the discretion to impose a higher or lower sentence to lean toward the higher end. And in some cases, may even result in mandatory sentence increases. So for example, under the United States sentencing guidelines, if a person is currently serving a term of probation or parole at the time of a new offense, even if the reason that they are still serving the term is due to outstanding debt, the sentence increases. Driving with a suspended or revoked license, which as we have just heard is often as the result of non-payment, may also require a mandatory uptick in sentence. And even further downstream, it could make the difference between being held in prison or released. And this is again, something that relates to the development of risk algorithms. So what we see here is that the inability to pay economic sanctions can interfere with a person's return to the community by barring them from full citizenship. And by the way, this isn't just about voting in presidential elections. It's also about having a voice in things like who serves on your child's school board. But we also see that the inability to pay economic sanctions can mean that a person is punished longer and more severely than those who can pay. In the interest of time, I'll go ahead and stop there.
Great, thank you. We have such a wide array of issues already to be thinking about. Let's just push deeper on a couple of these points. What are some particular tools that governments use to try to collect outstanding debt that is associated with fines and fees? And I'm going to start with Ms. Buddin on that question.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we've heard a little bit about several of them, especially around the driver's license component of it. And I think the threat of all of these different consequences we've been discussing today is certainly a tool within itself. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the subrogation process. And so I actually used to do subrogation for a municipality before I came to the ACLU of Michigan. It's not a job I'm quite proud of, but my job was specifically to call folks who owed different fines and fees to that particular city and try to establish a way to make them pay. And so often we see this threat of suspending a person's license or arrest, issuing a warrant, anything like that, as the main way to force them into payment plans that they otherwise couldn't really afford and end up often defaulting on, ultimately, so that you can kind of go down the rest of the process. And this is because there's a lack of non-financial individualized alternatives. But one in particular I wanted to talk about is asset forfeiture. And so essentially this is where the government is able to take ownership of a private citizen's property or cash, whatever it is. And this is different than seizure. So seizure is the actual taking of that item, and forfeiture is the process of taking ownership of it. And so what we see a lot of times is that these individuals who can't afford to pay their fines and fees, they end up having a warrant issued, or they're driving on a suspended license, et cetera, et cetera. They're then pulled over, they're stopped, and law enforcement is able to seize their property and put it into this forfeiture system. And up until recently, property could be forfeited. You could lose ownership over your property, even if you haven't been convicted of a crime. So it's a whole separate legal system that this is going on. This is a civil system. It's not a criminal system. And so prior to the person being convicted, prior to them even being charged, So they can be legally innocent and lose ownership over this property that the government believes has been used in commission of some sort of crime. And they don't even have to be the owner of that property. So this could be they borrowed their mom's car, they borrowed a girlfriend's car, a boyfriend's car, whatever. And so people were losing things like their homes, their vehicles, cash, PlayStations. I mean, just all types of things that had nothing actually to do with funding a court system or had to do with that person being a danger to the community or anything like that. And this was just simply, it's a punishment. It's a way for then the government to sell this property or use this property as a mechanism to funding itself. And we saw lots of abuses with that. But in addition to that, a person who was too poor to be able to afford fighting this system, there was initially a cost associated with just filing a challenge to asset forfeiture. So if you can't afford to pay the fee that led to your arrest in the first place or to your property being seized in the first place, you're not likely going to be able to afford to then challenge that and go through the legal process of challenging that. And luckily the legislature did change that law so that the fee can be waived. But this is still a law that's on the books, and it's still a costly situation for folks to have to go through. And so this is certainly another place that we need to see additional reform when we start talking about fines and fees. We also have to continue to talk about the conversation around forfeiture proceedings as well.
Thank you. Professor Colgan?
Yeah, I'll just add that there are, states are pretty creative about how they can engage in collections. We've heard about asset forfeiture, which is a really important thing to be thinking about in conjunction with fines and in its own right. We've heard about warrants being issued to try to force people back into court to pay. But states also might engage in tax intercept so that any tax refund that you would otherwise be receiving, including earned income tax, is intercepted and applied toward the various payments. It might, in some jurisdictions, depending on the nature of the offense, it could shift to civil collections, which in some cases it can end up really harming your credit. In other cases, it doesn't end up on credit reports, depends on the particular state's mechanisms. Some states impose liens on your property. So even if there's not a civil asset forfeiture issue, that you might have a lien on your property, which prevents you from being able to sell it. And wage garnishment is actually an important tool that is worth paying attention to, in particular because there are ways in which wage garnishment, which requires your employer to actually go through a garnishment process each time they pay you, may interfere with employment, because private employers don't want to have to deal with wage garnishment. And so it could have implications for your ability to obtain or maintain stable employment as well, which of course then interrupts your ability to pay the economic sanctions. So all of these different mechanisms could be in play. Again, it just depends on the jurisdiction, but it's important to think about the downstream consequences for folks of the various tools that are used.
Thank you. There have been some references to ability to pay. So ability to pay determinations may affect whether a person is forced to pay fines and fees or not. What is an ability to pay determination? What is that process like? And what are the consequences of that determination? I was going to start with Professor Prescott on that question. Yeah.
Sure, I'll be quick. I mean, courts, I think sometimes, especially law students who are just starting out, don't realize that, of course, things can be done in a zillion different ways. And unless, there's a law or somebody willing to enforce a set of rules, then you should expect a wide array of processes. And that's what we have in the US. I mean, at a very basic level, states ask courts to decide whether somebody is able to pay. And they can do that in pretty much any way they want as a baseline. There have been some reforms in this space in recent years where some judges are expected to write down their reasons for the decision, or they're expected to take into account certain considerations while they're making that determination. But by and large, there's an incredible amount of discretion, and so to suggest it's a process it makes it sound as if, there's guardrails on this street, but in reality, a lot of times it's somebody saying, I can't pay, and then a judge or some member of court, of the court staff, asking questions that they think are relevant that may be different depending on the color of your skin or how you're dressed. And presumably that doesn't take very much time because there are a lot of people coming in, and you're not spending hours trying to determine whether or not somebody's able to pay. So you ask them some questions, you ask them for some proof, and then you make a call quickly and move on.
Did you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead, Professor.
Okay. So yeah, there's not one standard mechanism for determining ability to pay. It really varies depending on the jurisdiction. So different states and the feds do different things differently. Local courts as well. It could depend on the judge that you get within those jurisdictions. It also can depend on whether we're talking about front end at the moment of sentencing versus back end for something like probation or parole revocation, where there are actually typically some more nuanced mechanisms for ability to pay for permanent. And I say typically that's it really, again, depends on the jurisdiction and how well they're adhering to various constitutional rulings on these issues. But I will say that just a couple of things to have in mind about ability to pay determinations. And one is something that Professor Prescott's already alluded to, which is the importance of thinking about subjective versus objective factors when determining ability to pay. If the judge has the authority to say, you've got nice shoes on, whether you got those shoes at Nordstrom or Goodwill, but you've got nice shoes on, so I'm just going to assume you can pay. That's a real problem when we think about these kinds of mechanisms having any sort of real meaning. If instead we're looking at what are your sources of income, what are your expenditures, what are your other how many dependents do you have, that kind of more objective criteria, we could be a little bit less concerned about that kind of subjectivity. But even in that, we have to be cautious. And there's a great piece in the NYU Journal of Law Reform written by Teresa Jen, and Professor Prescott has alluded to this earlier as well, where it's, there are issues around forcing people to come in and talk about their circumstances and how embarrassing that can be. There are also real problems anytime you're projecting ability to pay forward. So it's not just what can you pay right now, but what are you going to be able to pay a month from now or a year from now, where we might not be able to adequately account for things like structural racism and the implications of that for being able to obtain housing and employment. How is a judge supposed to predict, if this time last year a judge was predicting what someone could pay a year from now, that judge would have had pretty much no ability to predict the economic consequences of the COVID pandemic, right? So one of the things we also need to be thinking about when we're thinking about ability to pay mechanisms is, how do we ensure that there's something in those mechanisms that allow us to amend, right? That down the road someone can seek relief if they have a change in financial circumstances, if something happens where really they may have had an ability to pay at one point, but that's changed. But also to be really cautious about the tool itself and making sure it cabins judicial discretion sufficiently.
Great, thank you. So there's been some mention about recidivism and about issues like voting rights being impacted here. I just want to go a little deeper on how fines and fees can impact reintegration of returning citizens and recidivism as well. Ms. Buddin, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of the things that we've already talked about today certainly are impactful for returning citizens. I think the two main places that we see the most success for returning citizens is around housing and employment and the ability to obtain those. And certainly if you have fines and fees that are hanging over your head that you're unable to afford, or that you're having to dedicate a paycheck to, or pay a driver's license reinstatement fee, all of that's going to impact your ability to have affordable housing and to find employment for some of the reasons that Beth pointed out earlier, or to have employment that's enough so that not only are you unemployed, but you might be underemployed, as well as your ability take custody of your children, to care for your children and your family. And so family reintegration is also is also important to think about when we're talking about fines and fees. And that's just made even more difficult, aside from the fact that a person has a criminal record, which we already know impacts their ability to get housing, employment, and healthcare, and their voting rights, and all of that anyways. But certainly having fines and fees hanging over your head is going to keep you under the cycle of poverty. It's going to keep you under the arm of the criminal legal system. And Beth did a fantastic job pointing out the issues around probation and parole and restitution. And if you sometimes, in certain situations, if you're not paying this, you can have a technical violation, which leads to a rearrest. And oftentimes paying your fines and fees is and your restitution is associated with your ability to get any sort of expungement. That may be a precursor. And we've seen some recent changes around expungement, but certainly that's still a conversation that's happened, and something that's still a precursor to getting that expungement. So even clearing your record after decades of having no additional contact with the criminal legal system continues to be an issue, because people are unable to afford their freedom, unable to afford their justice. So really, we have a system that is releasing folks with this expectation of reintegration, and expectation that there's going to be a positive contribution on their behalf, but pulling away all of the resources that would allow them to do so. So it really makes absolutely no sense, and this is a huge impact on returning citizens.
Thank you. And just the few minutes we have remaining, I just want to open it up to all of the panelists if you either want to respond to that question or to each other's comments or anything that we haven't reached yet.
I'm happy to add just one thing that's related to ability to pay, and that also ties this conversation into the defund movement that I think it's important to pay attention to, and that's that, you know, one of the things that is likely to happen if we engage in meaningful analysis of ability to pay is that we see individual relief, right? That folks are now only assessed payments or assessed amounts that they actually have a meaningful ability to pay. And one of the interesting things about that is it can result in revenue increases, both because the money's actually coming in, people who are able to see a light at the end of the tunnel are more likely to pay, but also because the costs of collection are going down. And those revenues are often used to fund criminal legal systems, law enforcement, policing, prosecution, indigent defense representation in the courts themselves. And so one of the things that we really need to be thinking about is how this ties into those mechanisms. And while I agree with the comment by Professor Prescott earlier that there may be some places in which fines might be an appropriate solution, if we can figure out how to get a wide list of things right, we also really need to be paying attention to where the money goes.
All right. And on that note, I want to thank all our panelists for this really rich discussion. I think it's drawn out a lot of the complexities of this issue. I know I've learned a lot. I expect our audience has as well. So thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you.